framework. Now, that's a position that has been reached really only over the last 3 to 4 years. It was the case until 2011 that private providers in the UK system were accredited by a significant number of private accreditation bodies. From 2011 onwards, that was changed so that the private providers were brought within the same system as the public providers. I think that makes absolute sense in terms of the student interest. I think it also makes sense in terms of a sector which is changing, where, as I said earlier, some of these boundaries between public and private are moving anyway. But it does lead to some challenges, and I'll come on to those challenges in a moment. I've mentioned that the code is developed with the sector, and it sets out the expectations, 18 expectations, that all institutions need to fulfill so that we can deem that they have met the expectations of the UK Quality Code. The system in the UK is very much premised on the fact that universities are autonomous and self-governing, and therefore the regulation of the higher education sector is what we describe as co-regulation. The prime responsibility for quality and standards rests with the institutions themselves. That's a very fundamental point. QAA is there to provide external assurance that autonomous, independent institutions are fulfilling their responsibilities. So it's co-regulation. That's an important principle. It's institutional level review. That isn't to say that there aren't other accreditation visits, particularly for professional degrees, where professional organizations go in and check that a particular program will prepare students to practice as engineers or as chemists or whatever the particular professional area might be. But the work that we do is only at institutional level. Until 2002, we also reviewed at subject level. But that was abandoned in 2002 because of another factor which recurs whenever there are discussions about accreditation, and that is the concept of burden. The idea that you've got to get the balance right. If there's too much external regulation, institutions will be diverting resources that should be spent on their core purposes simply to preparing for endless regulatory visits. So subject review went in 2002, abolished completely, with the idea being that institutional level review tells you something about the way the whole institution is managing its provision, rather than just finding good practice in particular subject areas. We evaluate against the quality code, and within the quality code, I ought to say, we also maintain a framework of qualifications. So we say what a bachelor's degree is, what a master's degree is, what a doctor's degree is. And we also maintain subject benchmarks. And the presentation earlier on and the emphasis on learning outcomes is particularly relevant because we're not prescribing in those subject benchmarks exactly what universities should teach, because that would be to impinge upon the autonomy of institutions. What we are saying is, across the sector, there is an agreement that a graduate in this particular discipline should emerge with these kinds of outcomes. That's how we approach our engagement with subjects. We look at the way in which the institutions are managing against the quality code. The quality code isn't something that they pull off the shelf just when QAA comes to visit every 6 years. They should be using it all the time in their own internal quality assurance procedures when they're developing new programs or evaluating existing programs. There's a strong emphasis in our system on enhancement and improvement. Yes, of course, you must meet what we call threshold standards, the basic standards that say whether or not you're exercising your responsibilities as a UK provider. But you've got to do more than that. There's always the belief that there should be a continual circle of improvement, that quality assurance has to be able to address that, and indeed, in some respects, help to support it and stimulate it. Continual improvement, not simply reaching a regulatory minimum. And we publish our reports, like WASC, we've taken the view that our duty to the public means that we must publish all our reports. And if you go to our website, you'll find the reports we've published on all our universities and colleges are there on our website. So transparency, openness, public communication are key values. We use a main system of review called Higher Education Review, and gradually, in the spirit of it, gradually ensuring that all institutions fall within the same framework, we have extended Higher Education Review to cover the further education providers and now also the private providers, the alternative providers. We also look at embedded colleges, those colleges within universities that particularly provide access for international students. We look at transnational education. Currently, we do that on a country-by-country basis. Most recently, we've reviewed UK provision in the West Indies, in Trinidad and Tobago. Later this year, we'll be reviewing UK provision in Crete, Malta, Cyprus, Malta, and Greece. We've reviewed China. We have reviewed provision in the United Arab Emirates. We conduct degree awarding scrutinies, and those can be intense. Sometimes those scrutinies will take a year, over a year, because once a UK provider has degree awarding powers, if they're a public provider, they have them forever, and if they're a private provider, they are renewed every 6 years. But it's a very substantial power, and therefore it takes a long time to actually demonstrate that you're able to manage that. And finally, we have a concerns scheme. We developed this in recent years because we realized that in the light of increasing willingness on the part of students to assert their rights in higher education, their expectations, to complain when they didn't feel that they were getting the education that they were entitled to, it wasn't simply enough to say, we'll look at that when we review that university in 3 years' time, 4 years' time. So we developed a system of immediate investigation for particular problems. These are problems which are acute, which seem to affect a significant number of students, and which may lead to reputational damage to the UK higher education system. Typical review process, the gathering of evidence, first of all, including a self-analysis on the part of the university or college concerned. Our review team, and remember their peers, supported by QAA staff, they conduct an analysis of that documentation. What is this documentation telling us? Where are the gaps? Where are the inconsistencies? Where are the areas where we need to ask more in order to establish the evidence? The team meet, they then conduct their review visit, and they write their report. And the report, as I say, is published. And every report results also in an action plan. And the action plan, as the name suggests, is the way in which the university or college concerned agrees that it will address any issues that have been found through the review. We also, of course, celebrate good practice. We publish databases on our website of all the examples of good practice that we found in the institutions that we visit. It's not only about finding problems, in fact, far from it. Often it is about finding very good practice and making sure that that practice is spread more widely across the whole sector. So trust. Trust in the UK model. Strengths and challenges. Well, some of the strengths of the system that we've evolved, I think, are that there is a strong relationship between QAA and the sector, the higher education sector itself. Legally, we are owned by the higher education sector. We are a charitable body. We're a third sector organisation, you would call it in other contexts. That's a legal ownership. It is not ownership of what we do. We speak about being operationally independent. No institutions, indeed no other agencies, including the government, can directly have an impact on, interfere with, or engage with the work of a review panel. The review panels must reach their own conclusions independently. Even I, as Chief Executive of QAA, can't change what's in a review report. I may wish I could. I may find it inconvenient when I have to have a difficult conversation with the Vice-Chancellor of a university, but the review panels are independent. Co-regulation, I've already touched on co-regulation. It enables, our system enables mature providers to establish a track record. If you look at some of the universities on our website, you'll see that they've now recorded 4, in some cases even 5, external reviews. It's been more fine-tuned recently in a risk-based direction. And again, this was touched on this morning, and for us it's important too. I mentioned the great diversity of the system now, and that's a diversity that we think is only going to get even greater. When we were dealing with a relatively small group of universities, what seemed important then was to treat everybody exactly the same and to have exactly the same review at every institution. Now we have a much more diverse group of bodies that we're reviewing. That method simply doesn't work anymore. We have had to become more risk-based. We have had to take into account the track record. We have some institutions that have been around for hundreds of years. We have some institutions that were established last year. We have to calibrate the degree of risk presented by different kinds of institutions. So we have to be proportionate. We have to be flexible. And we have to focus our attention where it's most needed. We have retained the focus on enhancement and development, and sometimes that hasn't been easy. In the debate about accreditation and quality assurance, sometimes there have been voices saying it should just be about meeting the regulatory standard, nothing else. But we believe a strength of the system is that commitment to a much wider vision of quality, which is about constant improvement. And the thematic elements and the system-wide analysis have responded to that point that I made earlier. We're not just looking at individual institutions, we're looking, and we regard ourselves as safeguarding a whole sector. We've developed real strengths, I think, in our system in engagement and working collaboratively. Excuse me. Students have become involved at every level of our work. We have a team within our organization which is responsible for engagement, for active engagement with students, and increasingly, of course, also with employers. We have a student advisory board which reports directly to our board of directors. And we have student accreditors, student reviewers. Every review team has a student member. The action plans I referred to have to be agreed also by the student body within the institution. So we're working with our subscribing institutions. We're working increasingly with employers. We're working with other agencies within the higher education sector, the agency that gathers national statistics, for instance, with some of the government agencies that are responsible for handing out government money. We're working directly with government in terms, for instance, of international students and in terms of those institutions that want to access students funded by loans. And we're working with international partners. QAA now has formal agreements with 16 other quality assurance agencies in other countries. And those partnerships are very important to us. They can be important in terms of learning and developing what we do ourselves, but they can also be important because of the international nature of our system in the sharing of information about what's taking place in various parts of the world. It's another subject for another discussion, but we believe that the future of quality assurance, just like the future of higher education, is increasingly going to be international. And the accreditation agencies in countries around the world will need more and more to work with each other and to trust each other. To trust the work of other agencies is really important. Challenges. Those are some of the strengths, but what are the challenges? We've had a challenge to establish trust. I mentioned that it's only in the last few years that the private providers and the further education colleges have come within QAA. And rightly, those new providers have challenged us to say, do you really understand our kind of institution? You're very experienced at dealing with the traditional universities, but we're not like that. We're different, we're newer, we have different ways of conducting our teaching and learning. Do you understand us? And so we've made a special effort to make sure that we have, as an organization, changed and developed and learned to work with these different kinds of providers. We're now encountering institutions that sometimes have very short track records, very short track records. They want to get up and running immediately, and they get frustrated about the need to establish some kind of track record. And we have to balance the interests of students with the interests of these new providers who want, as soon as they can, to be offering recognized qualifications. There are tensions as well between different types of institutions, regardless of QAA. The organizations representing the traditional universities are in one area, and there are now new organizations representing different kinds of universities, or new providers, or private providers. So increasingly we're seeing a number of different groups. And we have to relate to all of them. We have to relate to all of them. The tensions, the risks from failure are always greater. All the time they're becoming greater, both for institutions, for whom failure to get QAA approval can mean the removal of their right to recruit international students or loan-funded students. For the UK higher education system as a whole, which in many parts of the world is in competition with other, particularly English-speaking systems such as the US and Australia. And the risk that failure in one institution will damage confidence in the whole system. And we see that again and again, that when the media identify failure in one institution, they will describe this as being a failure of the whole system. Comes back again to that need to look at the whole system. This debate about light touch or under-regulation, well-run institutions with a long track record would always say to us, we want a light touch. You must trust us. You don't need to keep looking at the same things again and again. At the same time, there's a lot of public concern, a lot of media concern, that some providers have been under-regulated. And there's a need to strengthen the way in which those providers are accredited and quality assured. And this debate about proportional to burdensome. For one institution, it's proportionate, for another, it's a burden. Getting that balance right is very difficult, and we keep having to try to recalibrate it in the light of new concerns. We see these playing out sometimes right at the level of government policy. And there's a quote there, published quote from January earlier this year, where our government said that it wanted to take a number of steps to secure improved standards among alternative providers. I put this quote up here because it's indicative of what I've been saying about the importance of the whole system as well as individual institutions. You'll see the concern here. Britain's system of higher education is renowned worldwide for its high quality. It is essential that this reputation for quality continues to strengthen in all parts of the sector. This is an interest that goes beyond the interests of any single university or college. There's been the development of an investigation team to look at acute issues, and also we're increasingly interested in indicators of risk. I mean, after all, it's quite reasonable for institutions to say, if you're going to make a judgment about whether we represent a high degree of risk or a low degree of risk, what are the indicators you're using in order to reach that judgment? And we have to be transparent about that and open about that. Now, we have a general election in the UK tomorrow. And you will I'm sure, understand that I can't say anything about matters of government policy today in particular, so I won't. I just observe the fact that for all systems everywhere, certainly in all democratic countries, we face regularly changes of governments, changes of political imperatives, changes of policy direction. And in our particular context, that is intensified by the fact that we have a general election tomorrow for the UK, but the following year we also have elections for the Parliament in Wales and in Scotland and in Northern Ireland. So we're dealing with a very complex situation, and we wait to see what impact that will have on public policy and the higher education sector. Will there be a new higher education bill? I'm not going to offer any opinion on whether or not there will, but the interplay between the legislative framework, we heard about that this morning in the Minister's comments, and the way in which quality assurance is actually conducted is always an interesting one and always an important one. Moments of legislation are points of significant development for agencies like my own. We're currently, and this is why it's so helpful to come to discussions like these and to learn from the experiences of other people, we're currently undergoing another review of the way in which we conduct quality assessment, quality assurance within England, Wales and Northern Ireland, not Scotland. They've decided not to do that at the moment, but within the other three countries there's currently a review. I've been Chief Executive of QAA for about 5.5 years, and I think this will be the third national review that we've had during that time. This is the point I made earlier on about needing to keep up with constant policy change and development. But you'll see in that published letter from the Higher Education Funding Council, that extract, you'll see some of the words that I've already highlighted as being significant words in designing a good accreditation system. Risk-based, proportionate, affordable, low burden, and of course widely respected. It has to do all of these things. Sometimes there's a tension between those differing priorities. New arrangements that will build on established strengths and good practice, and I hope I've been able to indicate to you what by common agreement are some of the strengths of our system. Reflecting the values and culture of higher education, that's a reference particularly to this absolute importance of institutional autonomy and academic freedom, which are values that are held very highly by universities everywhere, I think, and certainly in our own context. But you'll see also, after the values and cultures, value for taxpayers and students as well. This demand that the benefits of quality assurance be both low cost and demonstrable, the value added. Where's the value? You have to be ready to answer that question about where the value is that you're adding to the whole process. I hope that's given you an insight into the context for our system, the way in which it's grown up, and some of the challenges that we currently face in reviewing it and developing it and taking it forward to the next stage. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to the further discussion. Thank you.